Hello, welcome to Drugs Unwrapped with me, Rob. Today, I am delighted to be joined by a good friend of mine, actually, Ant Lehane. Ant, how are we, buddy? You okay?
Rob, yeah, very good, thank you. And delighted to see your face. How have you been?
Good, busy. Yeah, it's nearly the middle of February, which is just absolutely crazy. I can't, like, Christmas is just a distant memory now. So
Yeah,
it's,
time flies.
yeah, absolutely. But no, it's really good to see you. We haven't caught up actually for a few months. You've been in the US. So whereabouts in the US were you?
I have, yeah. I was in California for a little bit of January, which was quite nice. I've become a big advocate for the winter holiday as opposed to the summer holiday. I was seeing my partner's family over there and trying to get some time in ahead of what is going to be an extremely busy year for people in campaigns and policy roles like ourselves. So, yeah, thought I'd get the
Absolutely.
rest before the hard stuff starts.
Yeah, California, man. I'm not jealous at all. I was stuck in Swansea whilst you were sunning it up in California.
Oh, well, we had a lovely time in Gorsinan back in the Labour campaign days. It was a
That's
lovely part of the world, I thought.
that's going back a few years, isn't it? Wow,
It
yeah.
really is. I want to say 2019, maybe.
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah. But in terms of for you, Ant, then, so very briefly, for those that don't know you, I would say, where have you been? But for those that don't know you, are you able to just very briefly explain your role within Cranstoun and also what Cranstoun are all about?
Yeah, delighted to introduce myself. So Cranstoun is a social justice and harm reduction charity. We deliver services in 5 areas, which are drug and alcohol support, criminal justice, domestic abuse, housing and homelessness, and children and young people services. I think all the areas that we deliver service in are quite interrelatable, which I find really interesting from a policy point of view. I don't think you can look at domestic abuse without looking at the impacts of substance use on some of those relationships. I don't think you can look at some of the antisocial behavioural issues that we have now without looking at cuts to children and young people's services back in 2010 under the coalition government. So yeah, I think from my past life where I was working at a think tank called Voltfast and as the secretary of the Labour campaign for drug policy reform, it's really nice to be working in some of those kind of surrounding areas. I think there's often a tendency that we work in silos in our services just by the way that they're delivered. And I think it's really nice to be able to get a view of the whole picture. And to be honest with you, I think it's a bit easier talking to politicians in the job that I do when you start talking about some of the interrelating areas to drugs and to people who use drugs. When you start talking about issues of homelessness, you start talking about issues of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, I think it puts you wrongly or rightly in an easier place trying to communicate those issues. So yeah, it's been really, really great. I've been at Cranston for about 2 years now. Thoroughly enjoyed working along such a great team and externally as well. I know obviously me and you catch up fairly regularly. Obviously you said it's been a few months, but yeah, it's a bit of a dream, to be honest. Really enjoying it. Obviously there's a lot of work to be done ahead of the big election year and on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, as I'm sure you are, we're extremely busy, but it's really refreshing to work in a place that is really passionate and really the antithesis to being stale. So before I moved into the charity sector, I had a bit of a preconception that some charities were a little bit stale. They didn't really want to rock the boat. My first sort of interview meetings completely got rid of that thought in my brain, and it feels really good to be working for a charity that really wants to deliver the best possible services for the people that we're here to represent, you know, in this instance, people who use drugs. So yeah, that's a bit of a long-winded description of what I do and who I am.
Yeah, it looks like you guys, obviously from the outside of it, I see quite a bit of you guys on social media and obviously follow, in terms of what you do. And yeah, it looks like from the outside anyway, you're doing some great work, which is fair play to you. And also, I think you're right in terms of all those different kind of things that you guys cover, substance use, domestic violence, homelessness, they're all so intertwined, aren't they? They're all so linked. It's really rare when somebody comes into a service like a drug and alcohol treatment service that actually that's the only issue.
Yeah,
it tends to be that they got many other things. So it's quite Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear that's, you as a service kind of cover so many different aspects really, as well. But no, thanks for that. I was going to
Thank
say,
you.
when we usually kind of catch up, we tend to like catch up for about an hour, and 30 minutes of that is just talking about the football. But I think we'll probably leave that for today, mainly because,
But
if we,
United are winning. So
yeah,
we'll
but
move on.
yeah,
We'll move on.
let's move on. But also, if we mention Jurgen Klopp leaving Liverpool, I think the most of the episode will be me crying. So
Oh.
yeah, but I'm sure you're delighted about it anyway.
Well,
But
he's a good guy. In a social justice lens, he seems like a good egg. So I'll give you
exactly,
that. But
yeah,
I hope he leaves.
exactly. but obviously, I'd love to do a
Mhm.
football podcast if I'm brutally honest with you, Ant. But
One day.
one day, hopefully. But yeah, so we've known each other probably
Mm.
for about, I would say, 5 or 6 years, I would say,
I
which is
think,
quite mad. I always lose a
mm,
couple of years in COVID. Like I always feel like
yeah,
it should be like 2022 now, do you know? Those 2 years
yeah.
of COVID just have absolutely thrown me. But yeah, so we've known each other for a little while now, and obviously it
Mm,
all came about from, like you mentioned at the top there, around the
mm,
Labour campaign for drug policy reform. So you were the secretariat, and
that's
you
right.
kindly asked me to be one of the Welsh ambassadors
You very
for
kindly
it.
stepped up, and you were absolutely amazing. So yeah, it was a
Yeah,
great entry to work with you.
yeah, it was cool. And obviously, like you mentioned, we did a kind of public kind of meeting in
Mm,
Gassinon in Swansea.
mm,
Yeah, it must have been 2019 as well. But with the Labour campaign for drug policy reform, then,
mm.
and obviously you kind of led on it. How did that initially come about? Like, what was ultimately your role? And then, yeah, just take us like briefly through the journey that led to ultimately recommendations being made
Cool.
on behalf of the campaign that ultimately ideally would feed in then to UK Labour.
It's a very good question. I think in terms of the sort of formation of the Labour campaign for drug policy reform, part opportunity, part political will. So my director at the time, Liz McCulloch, was speaking extensively to Jeff Smith, who is a Labour MP. Jeff has been for a long time now very, very vocal around the need to reform our drug policies. Jeff and Liz sort of spoke at length around how best to approach this. And this is in sort of peak Corbyn era. So grassroots policy making, for lack of a better way of putting it, was very much in vogue, if you like. We were kindly given the opportunity by the shadow cabinet at the time, or by the leader of the opposition's office at the time, or Jeff was given the sign off to put together the campaign. So he obviously at arm's length approached Liz as they were having discussions, and Liz took it on alongside myself. So she sat in the working group and was very much an architect of that campaign. She did a lot of the strategy around how we go and carry out the work we were doing. So what we were basically trying to do is to go and ascertain nationally, so in various both metropolitan and non-metropolitan communities, to find out what the local issues were, what the potential solutions were, what people wanted, and the culmination of that was 12 public meetings. I think we spoke to around 700 people just for the initial consultation, and that finished at the Labour conference. So we deployed a team of, I think it was about 20 ambassadors for the campaign, yourself and Jamie included, who were basically charged with being kind of local organisers for the area. So basically you guys did all the work and we just turned up and put some panelled events on. We recorded all of those events and transcribed the outcomes. We used sort of panel discussions with leading experts in the field of policing, academia, pharmacology, all the interrelating areas of drugs. We basically tried to put as many expert panels together. That information was synthesized by our working group, and the working group basically came up with 7 key recommendations. Alongside that, we did quite an extensive lobbying effort. So we had, I think it was around 16 MPs out publicly in favour of all 7 recommendations, various police and crime commissioners, countless numbers of councillors. And just to give some context, I'll just rattle through really quickly what the 7 key recommendations were, as it might set the scene nicely as to where we are now. So number 1 was to support an explicitly public health-based approach to drug use, moving away from a punishment-based model. Number 2 was to support the expansion of harm reduction measures that aim to reduce drug-related deaths. Number 3 was to invest in treatment and recovery services that help overcome addiction. Number 4 was to expand research programs into medicines derived from controlled drugs and review drug scheduling. Number 5 was to back police schemes that divert people found in possession of drugs away from the criminal justice system. Number 6 was to invest in schemes and services that address the social circumstances that lead to young people becoming involved in the illegal drug trade. And number 7 was to engage with worldwide discussions around the regulation of currently illegal markets. So yeah, that's the 7 key recommendations in a nutshell. Where we got to on that, obviously, politics blows like the winds and things change very, very quickly. I stepped away from my job at Voltfast and took up a job at Cranstoun. And I just thought at that point, alongside Lord Faulkner moving into the shadow cabinet, that sort of body of work was done. Now, I don't want to say that it's gone quiet, because it absolutely hasn't. It might have done in sort of public sentiments ahead of an election for wrong or for right. However, I mean, I speak to people like yourself really regularly. I was on the phone to another ambassador, Dougie, up in Edinburgh early on today. So actually, that network of campaigners who want to follow the evidence and sort of can sniff out a political opportunity to maybe make some meaningful change absolutely still exists. I don't want to massively elongate the answer, but I guess the next point is, where are we now with Labour in this? Is that what you're after?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, how were those recommendations received, and how welcoming was UK Labour as a whole of those recommendations? Did they kind of just go, okay, nice piece of work and we'll move on, or did they actually actively engage with those?
It's a really good question. They were certainly warmly received by a number of people who currently sit in the shadow cabinet. I'm not going to name names, but a bit of digging will tell you who they are. I think in short, it's the opposition's job in a lot of arguments to say they should be pushing the government on this. There's the other lens which you can look at it through, which is that in opposition at this moment in time, it is really, really hard for Labour to go out and campaign on those 7 key recommendations, particularly given the cost of living crisis. Obviously, we had COVID in the middle of the recommendations as well. So where I'd like to think it's at, obviously I'm a massive optimist at heart, is that those recommendations still stand very firm in terms of the Overton window. I think each one of those 7 could definitely be picked up by any government that comes in after the next election. I still think that they are politically ripe. Just picking apart a few of them as well since those recommendations, and I'm not saying it's because of the recommendations, because it was absolutely not a Labour specific thing. We've had OPCs come into play. We've had drug checking services for the first time, regular licensed drug checking services, in Bristol in the last couple of weeks. So I think it certainly helped turn the dial. I think it definitely helped with the ability for politicians to be able to talk about drugs more comfortably. I think it armed them with a document which is evidence-based, is sensible, is worded in a particular way which is slightly more safe for politicians. Now, I don't want you to think that I don't think politicians should speak out in favour of drug reform. I absolutely do. However, I'm acutely aware of the issues that when someone enters the cabinet or the shadow cabinet, or whatever the reason might be, that their public sentiment and their private sentiment might be very, very different. So I don't want to be too critical, but I'm equally aware that I might get some flack for not calling on Labour to come out more strongly in the immediate. Yes.
But is it a vote winner or a vote loser, Ant, do you think? Do you think if Labour came out now and obviously, looking at the polls in terms of ahead of the election, and it's kind of looking like potentially we're going to get a Labour government come the next election. Do you think if Labour were to come out and kind of say, look, we're going to potentially completely reform drug policy, we're going to completely reform kind of drug legislation, and obviously this is kind of more the extreme end in terms of when we're when I'm saying like we're going to do it all, to the point of let's look at even kind of like recreational kind of controlled legal markets of drugs, or regulated, should I say, not recreational. Do you think that could actually lose them votes, or even on the flip side, do you think that could help them win votes? Do you think, because I think from my perception, what I hear quite a lot of is, well, they can't say that because they'll lose votes. And actually, when you talk to the general public about certain drug-related matters, and you mentioned OPCs, so overdose prevention centres, or drug consumption rooms, when we've talked to the general public in certain cities and locations where our services are, the vast majority, of the general public are very much in favour, but then there just seems to be, like what I said, a general perception that, an MP can't say this, or, a certain kind of government can't say that because they'll lose votes. So where do you stand on that whole kind of philosophy that, drugs as a whole and drug policy as a whole is a potential vote winner or vote loser?
I think, in short, if you add lots of nuance and you can have a long conversation with someone about the merits and the evidence of drug policy or better drug policies, then I think it's a vote winner. There's an interesting bit of polling by Redfield and Wilton Strategies in 2022, which basically found that people in red wall seats, by and large, had the same attitudes towards most drug policy reforms as those in more metropolitan areas like London, which I think was quite surprising. However, if you're a strategist in Number 10 or in the leader of the opposition's office, you're probably looking at those numbers not just in an isolated way, but you're thinking, if we come out and say X, let's say, for example, we want to regulate all drugs tomorrow because they're killing too many people, it's not necessarily how that might be received directly. It's how the other forces at play might choose to communicate that. We have, in my opinion, a slightly right-wing media system in our country. And I think any small incremental change is still absolutely hammered by the press. And I'm not saying politicians are right for not fighting against that, but I can understand when you're 9 months away from potentially getting government, in Labour's case, for the first time in 14 years, should it happen, we never know, then I can understand the hesitancy to not want to create a sort of division line. I'm not a political strategist, but wisdom dictates if you're looking at it purely through a political lens, then you don't really want to deviate too much from your opponents if you're an average of 18, 20 points ahead in the polls, especially if you can't actually do anything. So were Labour to come out tomorrow, or the Lib Dems or the SNP, and I know the Lib Dems and the SNP are significantly, and the Greens, of course, significantly more vocally progressive, or have been traditionally, the Conservatives are not going to turn tail and go and reform drug policies in the next 8 months if Labour put a big push behind it. What they can do is communicate through the lines and look at areas where they set out their messaging to indicate that there will be positive change. They acknowledge that antisocial behaviour is on the rise. We have an enormous backlog in our criminal justice system. There's a huge racial element, in particularly metropolitan areas, to the disproportionality in stop and search. And to give an example of that, and I know I'm focusing a lot on Labour here, that's purely just because of the my previous background.
Sure,
we can get into the other parties as well. But if you can't actually enact that change, or you can't force the change, to quote Alex Stevens' recent book, if you can't politically corner the government into doing something, strategically, are you better placed waiting for 8 months, trying to say the right thing quietly whilst waiting to hopefully, for their sake, get into power? I'll give you an example of that. The National Policy Forum document, which a little bit like the Labour campaign, is it's basically Labour officials, Labour members who are elected to in a position to differ from the Labour campaign on that front. But they basically synthesize a lot of submissions from organisations like Cranstoun, from the general public, from Labour members, and they've come out with some, what I think are quite good lines around diversion schemes. And I think there's some quiet messaging that there's an acknowledgement the current system's not working. Are they going to repeal the Misuse of Drugs Act and start talking about regulating all substances for I don't want to say recreational, but for personal use, if you like? Probably not. But I think I don't see any good, purely through a political lens, of Labour coming out tomorrow and saying, we need to reform our drug policies now. You need to do this in the next 9-10 months, however long the election's going to be away, because I just think it will create more of an issue for people who are struggling with dependencies, or people who are campaigning to try and reform these policies like ourselves, because it's such a strong narrative around, well, it's not a strong narrative in the media, it plays out as a very strong narrative around being tough on drugs. I think the biggest gift, to be honest with you, Labour could give the Conservatives was if they were to come out tomorrow and say that we're going to do all the great things that I really strongly agree with, purely because it will do more harm than good in the medium to long term and the short term. Now, I know that's probably quite a controversial thing to say. That's purely through a political lens. If it was up to me, I would absolutely want politicians to get real across the House and actually talk about the issues as they are, not play this political chess game. The reality is the political chess game is how elections are won and lost, sadly. But can we get the outcomes after that election? Should it go towards more liberal parties? That's where my head is firmly at in terms of sort of political campaigning.
I was going to say, it just sounds such like a chess game, in it.
Yeah.
It's so strategic, and I think, you made a really good point. If Labour were to come out and say something that may be quite drastic or quite out of the blue, with all of its good intentions, like you said, there's going to be certain media outlets that's just going to take that little soundbite and they're going to turn it, and ultimately there's no going back from that to a certain degree for those aspects as well. So no, it's really interesting to kind of actually hear the finer details of things. And so do you think, in terms of, I know you kind of touched upon it there a little bit, so do you think in terms of if Labour do come in, because I guess we kind of have to discount the other parties realistically, don't we? I don't think that the raving loony party is going to get in anytime soon. But
they got my vote.
Did they? Brilliant.
No, I'm joking. I've never voted for the raving loony party.
It's always good to see them up there, though. Do you know what was it? The London Mayor, Count Binface. He was one of my favourite.
I was going to say, if Count Binface runs in my Hackney seat, then I will certainly be voting for him. I shouldn't say that, or else I might get myself in trouble. But I do love Count Binface, and I do think, although there's huge issues in our country and in the world, actually some of that satirical side of how elections are run, when you actually put it into context, in a way, how ridiculous this whole thing is, it at least adds some of the comedic effect that we actually need. Because I'm an enormous advocate for drug policy reforms and want the most sensible policies possible. I'm talking to you about why I don't think Labour should come out in favour of something in the next 9 months. So it is, it's a ridiculous chess game, but Count Binface keeps it interesting, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. But if Labour were to come into power, do you feel like there would be any significant change to what we have currently got under the current government from a drug policy perspective?
Yeah,
and if so, and if you can say, do you see anything specifically what you feel would be different?
So I the conversations that I've had with various people across the Labour Party, private conversations have seemed really positive. There's not been much around details, and also those people probably tell me what I want to hear just to shut me up. So take it with a pinch of salt. But I do think there will be, meaningful, tangible change pretty quickly. I mean, that goes for, and I don't mean to pick on the Conservatives, but we've seen what they've done over the 14 years when it comes to drugs. So if any other party, or there's a coalition, whatever that might be, I think there will be meaningful change. And I can give you a few examples. So Scotland has made some good, meaningful change, but there's a sort of strange irony in that the SNP are calling for these big changes, and to be fair to them, they've come true on their word when it comes to the OPC. However, getting a second one over the line is taking a little bit longer maybe than it should be. Equally, they're in favour of drug checking. We've just seen in Bristol the last 2 weeks that within the Misuse of Drugs Act, you can legally do licensed drug checking, but it's not happening yet. So I think removing the Conservative fear would enable more change in Scotland. I think where I am now in London, Sadiq Khan launched a drug commission a couple of years ago off the back of the announcement that never actually happened around a young person cannabis diversion scheme pilot. So again, there's a lot of those conversations going on, but I think the reason the London changes haven't happened, particularly in London, is because there's this kind of dual strategy whereby Labour are terrified of not winning back the red wall. They assume red wall attitudes are slightly more conservative. I disagree with that, but that seems to be the perceived wisdom. So Sadiq Khan sounds like he's rode back on the drug commission, or he's parked it for a little bit. My hunch would be, and again, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, would be that the Labour HQ, the leader of the opposition's office, have probably said, maybe not in such obvious terms, but might have said, this isn't that helpful for us at this moment in time when we're trying to be more centrist. So my strong suspicion is that his drug commission's findings have been parked probably until after the election. He's also got his own mayoral election in May, which will be quite interesting to see where the opposition mayoral candidates go with that, because he has parked a big policy announcement. So we'll see in those metropolitan areas how big a swing that has on certain people. I mean, I certainly know people who are single issue voters, and I think they'll probably go and vote Green or Lib Dem or whoever that might be. So yeah, it creates a really, I don't know, for lack of a better putting it, a really sticky situation, and it's a really difficult chess move to come out of, if that makes sense. I mean, all the indications are that Sadiq Khan will probably win quite significantly, and actually he didn't need to announce his findings ahead of the election. Obviously, the drug reform campaigner in me says we've been waiting on this for a very long time. Very frustrating that I believe the work for the commission has been done, but it's kind of been put on ice until after the election. So yeah, we're seeing these little scenarios play out, which are kind of confusing, contradictory, morally frustrating, but actually, in my opinion, looking at the bigger picture, kind of makes sense. Strange as that sounds.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of with Sadiq Khan's cannabis thing, in terms of, I've completely forgotten about it, to be honest with you. So it's quite interesting that you mentioned that, and when you did mention it, I was like, oh yeah, what happened to that? But yeah, it's quite interesting really to see how that's kind of played out as well. And I think, when you said it's kind of confusing and yeah, just a chess game, that I think that's just politics generally, isn't it? That's from my perception anyway. It's just like, people say one thing one day and then they say another thing the next day. But obviously you've engaged with politicians a lot really over the years. Do you find that actually behind the scenes there are MPs and politicians, and obviously people maybe within the Senate and obviously within the Scottish Parliament as well, that are for, drug policy reform, but they've never actually come out publicly for whatever reason, as you've kind of already said. And actually, if they were to come out publicly, you might be like, whoa, okay, that's a little bit of a turn of events. Do you find that actually behind closed doors and when you're just talking to them kind of on an informal basis, that actually that perception and that will is actually there in terms of for some form of drug policy reform?
I don't think I've ever met a politician who privately said the current system is working.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so. A few of them might have gone the other way and said, actually, no, what we need is, more boots on the ground or more money for policing and, sort of going more punitively heavy on drug use, which obviously I massively disagree with. However, by and large, the vast majority of politicians that I've spoken to agree it's not working and agree we need to explore other options. Do many want to put their head above the parapet at this moment in time? Unfortunately not. I think sadly you'd be slapped down pretty quickly in either of the two main parties if you were to come out when you were in cabinet or in shadow cabinet and make a big statement around drugs. But I do think where politicians are a bit too risk averse is that there's really strong arguments where you can communicate the point that you're trying to make without giving the soundbite. So I think a really good example of that is around antisocial behaviour. So you'll know, obviously, Rishi Sunak and Number 10 banned nitrous oxide, which is already basically banned. It was a bit of a show policy. They added it to the Misuse of Drugs Act. Now, laughing gas canisters are definitely a doorstep issue, particularly in local elections. But there's other ways of talking about, what the solutions are without jumping immediately to that soundbite of, we're going to ban NOS. We should really be talking about, why are our streets so dirty? Why are we not having the funds among councils which are going bankrupt to be able to pick litter? Or why are we not having early interventions where people who start using laughing gas from a young age, and it's significantly used among young people, why are we not getting ahead of time to stop that problem developing? If I were to talk about it, I would talk about the cuts in 2010 to children and young person services, where youth clubs were massively slashed and cut. And that's the issue that I'd approach it as. If I were a Labour strategist, that's how I would have responded to the NOS ban. That actually, this isn't really about nitrous oxide, because there's as many McDonald's wrappers on the floor as there is nitrous oxide canisters. But this is an issue of people not having a place to go, or the sort of conditions of metropolitan society now lend themselves to, I don't want to say the word loitering, but I imagine people on the more conservative end of the spectrum would say, loitering, littering, all these kinds of things. Actually, what else are you going to do? I'm not encouraging anyone to go and use nitrous oxide, but you can understand how the situation develops. The only issue is people don't tend to get an hour podcast to talk about it. Unfortunately, they get a few quotes in a newspaper, and if they say one wrong phrase, then that's shredded, which is the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in. But again, it's that horrible chess game.
Yeah, absolutely. I always remember seeing a certain Welsh politician, kind of advocating obviously for the ban on nitrous oxide and saying there was a stain upon our kind of society, and in terms of obviously seeing the amount of canisters on the street. And I just thought, do you know what, like, I see crisp packets and empty water bottles a hell of a lot more on the street, and I was like, you're not going to ban them, are you? So the kind of the theory behind it was just, I don't know, I was quite astounded really, in terms of from a personal perspective, in terms of how they went about it. Because if you think of the Misuse of Drugs Act, you think of like your class A's, or they're the most dangerous, your class B's, okay, they're dangerous but not as bad as class A's. I think I may get the wrong end of the stick, but historically I've always thought it's based on, harm to the individual in terms of, from a physical and mental perspective. And this was different with nitrous oxide, that actually it wasn't going from that kind of harm perspective to the individual and to the user themselves. And yeah, it was going very much from an antisocial antisocial behavior. But it's interesting that you said then, in terms of actually, you can't think of a politician that you've met with, behind the scenes that kind of do advocate for what we currently have. And, I think it's quite pleasing really to hear that, because I think, you think of drug policy and actually how, again, it's interlinked with so many other kind of everyday kind of issues, whether that's environmental issues, in terms of climate change and how that's linked in terms of drug policy and everything to do with substances as well. And, and it would be interesting really to see in terms of actually how, and I do believe when drug policy reform in many states takes place, how that will have a knock-on effect with everyday kind of issues and everyday living really as well. But Ant, for you, if you were to, from a personal perspective, because I think in terms of obviously what you're saying here today is from the heart, I think that's what we kind of need really. But from a personal perspective, if somebody was going to vote, say the election is tomorrow and somebody's going to vote for a particular party purely based on their drug policy, who from your perspective would be that party or the contending parties? I know you've mentioned kind of Greens and Lib Dems, but is there one party that stands out for you in terms of their current drug policy within their manifesto?
I think it would be very unfair for me to not say that people who are very, as we say, plugged into the sort of drug policy reform community, for lack of a better way of putting it, in terms of kind of radical policy making, that would be the Greens. There's definitely no denying that. Now, I'm going to be a little bit controversial. I liked I'm basing this upon their 2019 policy manifesto. Now, I like a lot of it. However, I think that there were certain things within the manifesto, drugs related things within the manifesto, which might be better than what we have now, but I don't know if you can necessarily call them evidence-based, based upon the fact we don't have the evidence to know what will happen if you unleash everything all at once. Now, I'm pro full regulation of all substances, but I think when I think of full regulation of all substances, I think what's the biggest issue at the moment, or what are most people dying from? Now that's opioids, primarily heroin. So diamorphine-assisted treatment seems like a really evidence-based, sensible way to go about things. I think after that, we've really got to start spending some time, effort, money, and research. And there might have been things that I don't know about which do exist regarding stimulant replacement therapies and sort of DAT for stimulants, if you like. I think that makes a lot of sense. What I do have fear of, I'm not necessarily against it, what I have fear of is that were a Green Party to come in tomorrow and implement the manifesto that they put forward last time out, if it went wrong, we're absolute toast, basically. And unfortunately, it's not going to happen because with no disrespect intended, the Greens are only, I think, running a number of candidates, and they're targeting 4 or 5 seats. So if they were to unleash things like, say methadone in pharmacies was one of them, and I think pretty much all drugs from pharmacies, which is quite similar to that, I just have a lot of fear that if you try and make that huge sweeping change in one go, you could be walking into some serious problems. That's not to say that I don't disagree with the principles of all of it. I don't agree with the principles of all of it, and I don't disagree that full regulation is significantly better than criminalization, and particularly from a racial justice angle. However, it does genuinely worry me a little bit that if you implement policy badly, you can undo a lot of good work that's gone on for a long time. So I know I sound really negative and slightly pessimistic, but I think it's that kind of the political brain ticking and trying to hold myself back. But no, I mean, long story short, I think the Greens have the most progressive set of drug policies. I think that's kind of undeniable. Would you say Greens because
of the amount of progressive elements they've got to it, or are there particular features that kind of stand out for you?
In terms of why they adopt that position, or in terms of
why
why
you see them as like the leading contender in terms of their kind of drug policy within their manifesto?
So from memory, they had a regulated model for each individual illicit substance, not each individual illicit substance, but the example is a minute ago is mephedrone in pharmacy. So being able to go and buy I assume a small amount of mephedrone from a pharmacy, and then that was administered by somebody. I don't disagree with the sentiments at all, and I know obviously Steve Rolls of Transform did a really, really brilliant book on how you regulate stimulants.
Yeah.
I guess what goes off in my head, and maybe I'm falling victim to that same political aversion to risk, is that if you do it badly and too quickly, it could go very wrong. But that's not to say it's not the right way to go. So on a pure policy level, the Greens are definitely the most progressive when it comes to full regulation of most substances. The Lib Dems in 2019 backed cannabis regulation and a host of harm reduction measures. My personal hunch would be that they probably will go a little bit quieter on drugs in the manifesto this time out because of the seats they're targeting. Okay. Equally, the Greens can afford to, I think actually maybe there's 1 or 2 seats they're targeting. I think somewhere around Norfolk or Suffolk, but they have a seat in Brighton, which they'll obviously go back for. Caroline Lucas is standing down, and they're targeting a seat in Bristol, which is very liberal attitudes towards drugs. So that primes them to be able to campaign on it as a vote winner. Whereas the Lib Dems have the blue wall areas, there might also be a couple of seats they might want to try and pick up from the Conservatives, which don't lend themselves so much to liberal attitudes towards drugs. So it'd be very interesting to see how it plays out. But my top line hunch, I'll be very quick about it, will be the SNP will continue to be loud and proud about drugs, but it's cynically slightly using that to create a wedge between themselves and Westminster. Obviously, I think their intentions are absolutely all in the right place, but that's their side of the political game, if you like. Labour, I think, will avoid any conversation on drugs, maybe bar people like Sadiq Khan, who can get away with a bit more of a soundbitey argument because he's not an MP. So I think if Keir Starmer was asked, what are you going to do about drug policy? He'll say, we're tough on crime, tough on causes of crime. And he'd probably say, we're not going to change drug laws. The Conservatives will give a similar line. The Lib Dems, I imagine, will give something kind of nuanced. And as I said, the Greens would be very loud about their reforms, I think, which is fantastic because we need that voice. Absolutely. That's the kind of, in my mind, the sort of 20 years down the line, that's where hopefully we can be when we've proven that we can do it sensibly and in a sort of safe policy way, that we bring the public alongside us, policymakers alongside the public, to show them that it works. That's the sort of take of each political party's outlook, I think. Apologies, that was quite an elongated answer.
No, definitely. So Caroline Lucas is standing down, is she? She is, yeah. Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, it's a real shame. Caroline's brilliant. She came to our conference in Brighton last year, actually. She's brilliant. She's a really, really good person. She's been a very needed vocal supporter of, or advocate, for reforms to our drug policies. And it'd be very sad to see Caroline go. I'm not actually sure who they're putting up to try and keep the Kemp Town seat down in Brighton, but she'll be a big loss for the country and for the Green Party in particular.
Yeah, big shoes to fill anyway, isn't it, in terms of whoever they put forward for that. I think from a Welsh perspective, from memory, Plaid are probably the head of the game, really, in terms of from their drug policy. I know they've kind of, whether or not they've changed, but obviously they've talked about kind of drug consumption rooms within their policy, and obviously a former PCC up in North Wales was kind of like a big advocate and a lead on that. They were part of Plaid themselves when they were in office, but I think Plaid, I haven't looked recently, to be brutally honest with you, in terms of from that. But it's interesting you say, kind of going back with the Greens and kind of how you said about, that if we don't actually implement something appropriately, then actually can kind of bite us on the arse a little bit. And I guess kind of, and you've mentioned around Scotland and obviously overdose prevention centres. I guess a twofold question really for you, Ant. So I guess based on what you said, mentioned around the Greens and ensuring that the implementation of potential new initiatives and facilities are done correctly, do you feel that's why Glasgow, in terms of the drug consumption room they're going to start, is a very heavy medicalized model? Because basically you just want to get it right. It's the first one in the UK from a legal perspective that actually we just need to get it right. So therefore we're going to go by this medical model. And obviously, that the needs may warrant that as well. We obviously won't go into the absolute depths of Glasgow, because that'll be a completely different episode in itself.
Yeah.
But the second element of the question is, do you think that's a changing point, from a UK perspective? Because obviously the UK government has also come out saying that they're not going to stand in the way. Keir Starmer said they're not going to stand in the way. So do you think actually that is a change? It's a turning point. Do you feel, in terms of with the potential establishments of the OPC in Glasgow?
I think absolutely. It's certainly a moment. It took us a long time to get there, but no, I do think it's a turning point. And often these things are around timing. Now, I'd be wrong of me to talk about OPCs without mentioning the sort of way the issue was forced by my colleague Peter Criken, who obviously decided he was going to run one himself. He's braver than me, that's for sure. However, I think there was also a perfect moment, because it's happening just as what I like to call silly season in the election sort of cycle, if you like. The SNP have nailed their colours to the mast for a long time, so they were always going to do it. They had to deliver on it. They kind of were not appeased by Westminster, but I think Westminster didn't really have an interest in trying to shut it down, because they don't have a great deal of seats in Scotland. They see how high the figures are there. So it kind of suited both parties. And actually, somewhat, if we're talking in my very optimistic narrative of where the Labour Party would go after an election if they were to get into government, would be that actually that started sowing the foundations already, sowing the seeds already. So you have one little, it's quite big change, but albeit one centre, and then drug checking. So it starts to become normalised within the discourse. And then post-election, we have some evidence. You can go, okay, well, we can now roll out X number of schemes, and actually this works. So we can also look at more drug checking facilities, or we can look at diversion or full-blown decriminalisation of possession or depenalisation of possession. So I think timing-wise, it was very, very good. Now that's accidental. I don't think anyone designed it to be that way. But sometimes these things just take the Overton window being in just the right place for something to go over the line. Medical cannabis, I guess, that legislative change in 2018 being another example of the kind of, I don't know, the seas aligning. I can't think what the exact expression is, but everything aligning at once. So there was a big change in Colorado, which made people, as in this was on personal use of cannabis, which made people become more sort of aware to it. It didn't seem so crazy to have different cannabis laws. And then in the instance of the OPC, I think it took someone who had lived experience providing that narrative, that story of trying to take his own initiative to help people. In the case of medical cannabis and Billy and Charlotte Caldwell, was to do with the story of a very sick young boy who found that medical cannabis worked for his epilepsy and stopped him having seizures. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of way that these things have to align for it to work. But I think if there's a big majority for whichever party, I'm sort of saying it guardedly, but if there's a big majority, I imagine it would be for Labour. That leaves them with absolutely no excuse to not make wholesale changes, even if they don't say they're going to do that now. I would be very upset, shall we say, should they get into power and decide not to do anything if they have an 80-seat majority and nothing stopping them from making meaningful change. Because at the end of the day, this is about improving people's health, saving people's lives, keeping people who shouldn't be in the criminal justice system out of the criminal justice system. The only reason I've been so, I don't know the word is, so sort of cynical / pessimistic about why it can't all happen now before an election and why everyone can't be screaming that Labour needs to do something, is because the bigger picture dictates that were these ducks to align, then actually a big majority for a party which could be more palatable for reform could equal really, really positive results for our country, I think.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, in terms of actually we do have to look at the bigger picture. If we're 9 months from an election, cost of living crisis, for example, and high energy kind of prices and stuff is obviously on the tip of everyone's tongue, really. So, I think obviously, yeah, going back in terms of you have to be very strategic in terms of actually how you play drug policy, which I can imagine is potentially quite far down the line for many people in terms of just general thought process, really. And obviously, we focus on it because we work in that field, so to speak. Kind of to wrap up then, Ant, with your futuristic goggles on, so to speak, in 5 years' time, is there one thing that you feel that you're fairly confident that we will see in fruition in the UK that we don't necessarily see right now? So whether that's, for example, a regulated cannabis market, whether that's multiple OPCs, drug consumption rooms across the UK, is there anything that you feel in 5 years' time we'll be looking back and going, okay, we can't believe it took this long for this to happen, and actually it's now in place?
So I'm going to caveat all my earlier cynicism of let's not do anything ahead of the election, because it isn't really what I mean. But I guess the way in which we talk about it and what we do are kind of slightly different. So I think there is a lot of good work going on at the moment when it comes to diversion schemes and keeping people out of the criminal justice system. The drug checking agreement license kind of came about fairly quietly. I know there was a bit of a stink between the Loop, who do great work, and the Home Secretary at the time, Suella Braverman, but there's a lot of good strategic work going on to kind of do the behind the scenes stuff first. And I like to think that the work going on at the moment, and I highlighted diversion schemes to allude to the fact that I think it creates a mechanism for people to not be criminalized for drug possession. And I think in 5 years' time, people will probably start calling the most radical elements of it de facto decrim. I hate the expression, but it's the closest thing I can think of. So I guess what I'm saying is that diversion will lead to less people getting arrested, because it doesn't make sense as a policy for people to be arrested, thrown in prison, given a criminal record. But I don't think we'll call it decriminalization. So these things kind of develop a little bit. And again, that's about wriggling out what those Daily Mail, shouldn't really say that, should I? Right-wing buzzwords newspapers are. So I guess what I'm saying is I think a form of decriminalization or depenalization of the possession of all drugs will be the most tangible change to happen quickly. I think maybe I'm overlooking OPCs slightly just because there's one already. I think Edinburgh looks like it might be close as well. Feasibility study is just around the corner, I believe. I think diamorphine assisted treatment can happen within the existing legislative framework. So I think a lot can happen quite quickly, but it doesn't happen in the way that people expect it to. There's not going to be this front page announcement all of a sudden, a splash of saying, drugs are now decriminalized. It will be a lot of background strategic work, knocking down the barriers in local areas, in metropolitan areas, somewhat playing politicians and advisors at their own game. But yeah, I think how quickly people will not be charged, hopefully, for drug possession offences will be the most notable quick change. That's a pure guess, to be honest with you, but that's where I see it going.
Yeah. And I think what we tend to see is a lot of things tend to happen behind the scenes, don't they? You know, and there's kind of a work in progress, and actually, you know, we don't tend to kind of, or at least try to bring a public kind of light on it to a degree, you know, kind of just crack on with it, and isn't it, you know, with a lot of the stuff we do. And you know, and we've had many times where people believe we do stuff that we, you know, for example, that we allow people to consume substances within our bases, and obviously we don't, but people have that perception. It's like, oh, I thought you did that. So, you know, I think when these things do start to roll out, yeah, behind the scenes a little bit, I think actually it probably won't shock many people anyway, that, and they'll probably be like, oh, I thought you did that anyway. So
yeah,
it's yeah, but no, that was the absolute business. Is there anything else you want to kind of end on at all?
I guess yeah, my closing note would just be that I feel like the best strategy for achieving meaningful change when it comes to drugs is to work constructively. I like working with the police and understanding their concerns and trying to work with them to find policy solutions that work for their officers on the ground, for the more senior officers, for the public. And I think working constructively with all of our, you know, sector colleagues and beyond that, I mean, including, you know, police and medicine professionals as well, I think is the best way to go about things. I know some people disagree with me on that significantly, but I don't think shouting into the echo chamber usually works. That's not to say it doesn't every now and again, but I think trying to understand the concerns of people who disagree with you on the issue and trying to alleviate those concerns through strong evidence is absolutely the way to go. And apologies again for a very, very elongated answer, Rob.
No, you don't have to apologize at all, Ant. Yeah, absolute business. I think we
Thank
could
you.
chat at least for another hour, if not longer, on this. And you know, it's kind of just good to just touch upon a few things. And your insight is just incredible. You know, I could listen to you all day. Thank you very much, buddy. Hopefully we will catch up again soon. Take care, man.
You too. Thanks so much, Rob.